A cargo ship is on fire in the middle of one of the most critical waterways on the planet. The crew is in the water. 3 sailors are missing. And the force responsible for that attack just announced it will do the same to any vessel that attempts to pass through without its permission. This is not a hypothetical scenario. This happened on March 11, 2026, in the Strait of Hormuz. And what followed changed the global economy overnight. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. 21 miles. That is less than the distance between some city neighborhoods. And yet through that narrow corridor flows approximately 20% of the world's entire oil supply. Every single day, before this crisis began, around 138 vessels transited that passage. Tankers carrying crude oil from Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Iraq. Liquefied natural gas carriers from Qatar supplying Europe and Asia. Container ships moving the physical goods of global civilization. All of it, compressed into a channel barely wide enough for the vessels themselves to maneuver safely. When Iran decided to use that geography as a weapon, it did not need to close the strait completely. It only needed to make every ship captain, every shipping company, every insurance underwriter in the world ask one question, which was whether the cargo was worth the risk. And the answer, for most of them, became no. To understand how the US Navy entered the Strait of Hormuz and what that decision actually means, the story has to begin on February 28, 2026. That was the day the United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury, a coordinated series of strikes against Iranian military infrastructure. The targets included ballistic missile storage facilities, drone production sites, naval assets, and air defense systems that Iran had spent decades and billions of dollars constructing as its primary deterrent against exactly this kind of military pressure. Iran's response was immediate. And it was directed not at American military targets, where retaliation carried severe risk, but at the one domain where Tehran calculated it held a geographic advantage that no amount of American air power could easily neutralize. The Persian Gulf. The Strait of Hormuz. The waterway that connects the Gulf to the open ocean and carries the energy that powers the economies of Asia, Europe, and beyond. Within 72 hours of the opening strikes, commercial traffic through the Strait of Hormuz had ground to a near standstill. The U.S. Maritime Administration issued Advisory 2026-001 on February 28, recommending that all U.S.-flagged vessels maintain a standoff of 30 nautical miles from American military vessels and warning of the elevated threat environment across the Persian Gulf, Strait of Hormuz, Gulf of Oman, and Arabian Sea. Lloyd's List reported that by March 1, no tankers in the strait were broadcasting automatic identification system signals. The waterway was, for practical purposes, dark. What followed over the next several weeks was one of the most sustained campaigns of maritime disruption that the global shipping industry has experienced since the Second World War. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, which is distinct from the regular Iranian Navy and has primary responsibility for operations in the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz, began systematically targeting commercial vessels. The weapons used were a combination of surface-to-surface missiles, projectiles of various types, and in some cases what appeared to be unmanned underwater vehicles, essentially maritime drones designed to strike ships below the waterline where they are most vulnerable. The scale of the campaign is documented in detail. By March 12, the UK Maritime Trade Operations Centre, which monitors maritime security across the region, had received reports of at least 16 attacks on shipping and 4 additional suspicious incidents in the Persian Gulf since hostilities began. And that number continued to climb. The vessels struck represented a cross-section of the global merchant fleet. The Thai-flagged bulk carrier Meteor was set ablaze in the strait on March 11 after Iranian Revolutionary Guard forces confirmed they fired on it, claiming the vessel had ignored warnings. 20 of its 23 crew members were rescued by the Omani Navy. 3 remained missing. The Marshall Islands-flagged tanker Safe Sea Vishnu was struck while conducting a ship-to-ship transfer near the Iraqi port of Basra. Flames were captured on video engulfing the vessel. one crew member died. All 23 crew from the Maltese-flagged tanker Zephyros, struck in the same operation, were rescued after abandoning ship. The Liberian-flagged container ship Express Rome was hit. The Palau-flagged chemical tanker Paramol was struck east of Khor Fakkan, sparking a fire that forced 15 crew members to evacuate onto another vessel, with the captain reported missing. The Japanese-operated One Majesty sustained damage while anchored in the Persian Gulf. The Marshall Islands-flagged Star Gwyneth had its hull damaged by a projectile northwest of Dubai. These were not military vessels. These were cargo ships, tankers, chemical carriers, crewed by sailors from Thailand, India, Greece, the Philippines, and dozens of other nations that had nothing to do with the conflict between the United States, Israel, and Iran. Human Rights Watch documented that Iranian forces appeared to have deliberately targeted at least 2 civilian commercial ships on March 11 alone, characterizing the attacks as apparent violations of international humanitarian law. The economic consequences began registering within days. Crude oil prices rose by approximately 40% from pre-conflict levels, according to data cited by Human Rights Watch and the International Energy Agency. The IEA stated explicitly that the conflict in the Middle East was creating, in its assessment, the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. Iran's military spokesman Ebrahim Zolfikari warned publicly that oil could reach $200 per barrel as a result of the instability Iran was deliberately generating, saying directly that regional security had been destabilized. War risk insurance premiums for vessels attempting to transit the Strait of Hormuz had already risen from 0.125% to between 0.2 and 0.4% of the ship's insurance value per transit in the days before the conflict began. After the attack started, that calculation became almost irrelevant, because many underwriters stopped offering coverage entirely for the region. Protection and indemnity insurance, which is critical for shipping operations, had its war risk component removed for the strait as of March 5, making the economic risk calculation for ship owners essentially impossible to sustain. The Lloyd's List data captured the collapse of traffic in stark numerical terms. Before the conflict, approximately 138 vessels transited the Strait of Hormuz every 24 hours. By March 15, just 2 cargo vessels and 1 tanker were reported to be openly transiting eastbound out of the Persian Gulf. Some vessel operators were attempting dark transits, turning off their automatic identification systems and moving through the strait without broadcasting their position. Lloyd's List identified 17 such dark transits in the first 2 weeks of March, split between sanctioned and non-sanctioned vessels. Some Greek tanker owners were reportedly discussing night transits with AIS disabled, accepting the navigation risk in exchange for reduced visibility to Iranian forces. Around 8% of the mainstream VLCC fleet, the very large crude carriers that are the workhorses of global oil transport, was locked inside the Middle East Gulf with no clear path to exit. 33 non-shadow fleet-laden Suezmax and VLCC tankers were trapped north of Hormuz. A growing queue of vessels in ballast were unable to enter the Gulf at all. The geography that makes the Strait of Hormuz so economically critical is the same geography that makes it so difficult to defend. The strait is 21 miles wide at its narrowest. But navigable water is significantly less than that, particularly for vessels the size of modern oil tankers, some of which are over 3 football fields in length. Iranian territory borders the northern shore. The islands of Abu Musa and the Greater and Lesser Tons, which Iran has occupied since 1971, sit just inside the strait. The coastal city of Bandar Abbas, which serves as the headquarters of the IRGC Navy, is positioned directly alongside the waterway. Iran spent decades, beginning in the 1990s, constructing hardened missile installations on these islands and along its coastline, embedding anti-ship missiles into reinforced concrete bunkers that can be used to target any vessel transiting anywhere in the corridor. This geography was not built by accident. Iran's entire strategy for the strait is based on the principle of area denial, which means making the cost of entry prohibitively high for any adversary regardless of that adversary's overall military superiority. The IRGC Navy operates fast attack boats, submarines, surface-to-surface missiles, drone systems both aerial and maritime, and has trained extensively for exactly the scenario now unfolding. Every naval exercise Iran conducted from the late 1980s through to the present incorporated elements of strait control and commercial shipping interdiction. Jennifer Parker, a naval analyst and former officer with 20 years of service in the Royal Australian Navy, described the strait as presenting challenges that even the most sophisticated naval force in the world cannot simply overwhelm with firepower. The space constraints alone are severe. A U.S. Navy destroyer needs room to maneuver around the vessels it is escorting in order to get proper firing solutions against incoming threats. In a waterway barely wide enough for the tankers themselves, that tactical space is extremely limited. And Iran does not need to physically block the strait to achieve its strategic objectives. It only needs to maintain the credible threat of attacking any vessel that attempts transit, which creates the insurance and economic barriers that keep ships away without requiring Iran to engage in continuous direct combat. The U.S. Navy's response to the crisis went through a period of internal deliberation that became publicly visible in a way that was unusual and revealing. President Trump signaled on multiple occasions that the United States was prepared to escort commercial tankers through the Strait of Hormuz. Energy Secretary Chris Wright stated on Fox News that such escorts could begin, in his words, as soon as reasonable. Trump posted on Truth Social that he had ordered the U.S. Development Finance Corporation to provide political risk insurance and financial guarantees for maritime trade transiting the Gulf, and stated that the Navy would begin escorting tankers through the strait as soon as possible if necessary. But the operational reality was more complicated than the political messaging suggested. According to Lloyd's List, U.S. Navy officials briefed senior shipping industry representatives on Monday evening and told them directly that there was, in the words of one account, no chance of naval escorts happening anytime soon, and that no timeline for when such arrangements might become available could be provided. Less than 24 hours later, Trump had publicly reversed that position. The gap between the political commitment and the operational capacity was not resolved overnight. The constraints are real and documented. The U.S. Navy has 73 Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers on active duty. But only approximately 68% of U.S. surface ships are combat-ready at any given time when accounting for maintenance, training, and overhaul cycles. That translates to roughly 50 operational destroyers. Those 50 ships are distributed across every ocean on the planet, supporting commitments in the Pacific, the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, and elsewhere. The analytical firm Lloyd's List Intelligence assessed that a basic naval escort operation would require between 8 and 10 destroyers to protect convoys of between 5 and 10 commercial vessels per transit. At those ratios, even a fully committed escort operation might restore traffic to approximately 10% of pre-war levels. As of early March, the U.S. had 9 guided missile warships deployed to the Arabian Sea along with 3 littoral combat ships forward deployed to Bahrain. The 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit was ordered to the region with approximately 4,500 Marines and dozens of aircraft. The USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group had arrived in the CENTCOM area of operations on January 26 and was operating in the region. The USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group was also present, marking the largest simultaneous deployment of American naval assets to the Middle East since the opening of the Iraq War in 2003. The mine threat added another layer of complexity that Pentagon officials addressed publicly with some care. CNN reported that Iran had begun laying naval mines in the passage, citing sources familiar with U.S. intelligence assessments. Trump responded on Truth Social with a direct warning to Iran, stating that if any mines had been placed in the waterway, they should be removed immediately, and adding that military consequences would follow at a level, in his words, never seen before. U.S. Central Command subsequently announced that American forces had destroyed 16 Iranian mine-laying vessels operating near the Strait of Hormuz. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth said separately that by that point the U.S. had no clear evidence of actual mines having been laid, but that the mine-laying capability itself was being neutralized. The IRGC adapted to the loss of its mine-laying vessels by deploying smaller boats that were harder to track and interdict. According to the United Against Nuclear Iran analysis from March 16, U.S. forces had by that point destroyed more than 30 Iranian mine-laying vessels in total, but Iran continued attempting to deploy smaller platforms for the same purpose. Mine warfare is particularly challenging in the context of the Strait of Hormuz for reasons that go beyond the immediate military problem. Iran does not need to actually lay mines in large numbers to achieve a significant portion of the strategic effect. The credible threat that mines might be present is sufficient to deter commercial vessel operators, most of whom are not willing to transit a declared high-risk zone when the potential consequence is striking a mine and losing a vessel worth hundreds of millions of dollars along with its crew. The legal and insurance implications of transiting into a suspected mine field with a commercial crew are essentially prohibitive under normal maritime industry standards. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General Dan Kane addressed the threat picture at a Pentagon press briefing, stating that missiles rather than mines were currently the primary threat to merchant shipping in the strait, with Iran using surface-to-surface missiles to attack shipping in the northern section of the corridor. Kane also confirmed that U.S. forces were developing plans for commercial escort operations, though he stopped short of providing a timeline. Iran's decision to escalate maritime attacks beyond the strait itself represented a significant expansion of the conflict's geographic scope that caught some analysts off guard. The attack on the Kuwaiti Very Large Crude Carrier Al Salmi on March 31 occurred while the vessel was anchored at the port of Dubai, which is not in the Strait of Hormuz and is not in Kuwaiti waters. Dubai is a major global commercial hub. An oil tanker on fire at full capacity in its port waters creates risks that extend far beyond the immediate military dimension. The Kuwait Petroleum Corporation issued warnings about a potential oil spill. The fire was contained and no oil leak was ultimately reported, but the incident demonstrated that Iran was willing to extend its maritime campaign into the port infrastructure of Gulf states that had not formally joined the coalition against it. The attack on the Angolan-flagged oil tanker Senangol Namaib was even more geographically significant, occurring near Mubarak al-Kabir port in Kuwait, more than 800 kilometers from the Strait of Hormuz. The IRGC claimed the vessel was an American oil tanker. The attack caused an oil spill and represented what maritime analysts described as a significant expansion of the conflict's maritime theater, extending Iranian strike capability well into the upper Persian Gulf in ways that threatened the port infrastructure of multiple Gulf states simultaneously. On April 1, a Qatar Energy-owned oil tanker called Aqua 1 was struck by two projectiles north of Doha, causing a fire that was later extinguished. The IRGC claimed the tanker was Israeli. On April 4, the IRGC claimed it had attacked the MSC Ishaika with a drone in the Strait of Hormuz, asserting the container ship was linked to Israel. The pattern of claim justifications shifted over time from explicit U.S. or Israeli ownership to broader assertions of affiliation that critics noted were increasingly difficult to verify. The IRGC's own public statements about its legal framework for these operations deserve examination because they reveal the strategic logic Tehran was applying. IRGC Brigadier General Ali Mohammed Naini stated publicly on March 16 that Iranian forces were targeting all vessels owned by U.S. or Israeli entities regardless of their flag country. The IRGC announced on March 5 that the Strait of Hormuz would be closed only to ships from the United States, Israel, and their Western allies, while vessels from other nations would be permitted to transit following a process of Iranian authorization. On March 26, Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi announced that ships owned by 5 specific nations, including China, Russia, India, Iraq, and Pakistan, would be allowed to transit. Malaysia and Thailand received permission following diplomatic discussions. The UN was granted permission to allow humanitarian and fertilizer shipments through the strait on March 27. This selective access framework was not random. It reflected Iran's calculation that it could fragment the international response by offering continued access to nations whose economic interests were significant enough to prevent their alignment with the US-led position. China receives approximately one-third of its oil through the Strait of Hormuz. Russia had its own interests in maintaining Iranian goodwill. India, which had deployed over 5 frontline naval warships including destroyers and frigates under Operation Urja Suraksha to escort more than 20 Indian-flagged cargo ships, was engaged in direct diplomatic discussions with Tehran about transit permissions. The result was a fractured international response in which different nations applied different pressures or none at all depending on their calculation of costs and benefits. The U.S. Central Command warning issued on March 11 that Iran was using civilian ports for military operations was significant for the legal and strategic framework it established. CENTCOM stated explicitly that civilian ports used for military purposes lose their protected status under international law and become legitimate military targets. This statement was issued in the context of documented Iranian use of commercial port infrastructure to stage or support naval operations against commercial shipping. The legal principle CENTCOM was invoking is established in the laws of armed conflict, but its application in the context of the Persian Gulf, where commercial and military infrastructure are intertwined across multiple Gulf states, created a complex set of implications for the broader regional environment. The UN Security Council passed a resolution demanding that Iran stop what it characterized as egregious attacks against its regional neighbors and end threats to maritime routes. The resolution was co-sponsored by 135 countries. China and Russia abstained from the vote, stating that the resolution failed to hold the United States accountable for its role in the conflict. The abstention was consistent with the broader pattern in which China and Russia declined to apply pressure on Iran through the international frameworks that might have had some effect on Iranian behavior. The operational picture inside the strait itself evolved in ways that revealed the limits of conventional naval power in a contested littoral environment. Defense News published an analysis from military analysts Max Bremer and Kelly Grieco that drew a direct connection between the Red Sea campaign against Houthi forces and the current Strait of Hormuz situation. Their argument was that Iran studied the Houthi playbook from the Red Sea, in which cheap, distributed drones and missiles imposed costs that more than 800 U.S. airstrikes between 2024 and 2025 could not eliminate, and applied the same logic to the strait. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi stated on Iranian state television that Iran's power is the Hormuz Strait. That statement was not rhetorical. It was a strategic declaration of where Tehran assessed its leverage to be greatest. The analysis published by Bremer and Grieco identified a specific gap in U.S. Air Force doctrine as it applied to the strait. Air superiority, as defined in Air Force doctrine, prevents enemy air and missile threats from interfering with friendly operations. The United States had achieved significant degradation of Iranian air defense systems over southern and western Iran. But the strait required something different, which was persistent close-in coverage of a narrow geographic corridor against continuous drone and missile threats operating from hardened coastal positions and dispersed launch platforms. The assets required for that mission, forward-positioned aircraft and dedicated maritime patrol coverage, were in tension with the assets being used for the broader strikes against Iranian military infrastructure deeper inside the country. The historical average of 138 vessel transits per day through the Strait of Hormuz had collapsed. By mid-March, the number of openly transiting vessels on some days had fallen to single digits. Iran had achieved, without formally closing the strait and without deploying its full naval capability, a near-total disruption of commercial traffic through a waterway that carries 20% of the world's oil supply. The global economic consequences registered across multiple sectors simultaneously. The International Energy Agency's statement that the conflict was creating the largest oil supply disruption in the history of the global oil market was not hyperbole supported by historical comparison. Previous disruptions, including the 1973 Arab oil embargo and the 1990 Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, were significant. But the Strait of Hormuz in 2026 carries a greater volume of energy trade than either of those moments, and the disruption was occurring against a backdrop of global supply chains that had already been stressed by the Red Sea crisis of 2023 and 2024. Gas prices in the United States rose by approximately $1 per gallon within a month of the conflict beginning. U.S. stock markets entered correction territory. The White House came under growing political pressure to find a path toward de-escalation, with some congressional Democrats warning of an endless war scenario and calling for more transparency about the administration's strategic objectives. Senator Chris Murphy stated publicly that he saw a lack of planning around how to reopen the strait, adding that the situation risked becoming exactly the kind of open-ended conflict that the authorization framework did not contemplate. Saudi Arabia responded to the disruption by increasing oil flows through the east-west crude oil pipeline, which runs from its eastern oil fields to the Red Sea port of Yanbu, allowing some exports to bypass the strait entirely. The UAE activated the Abu Dhabi crude oil pipeline to move oil to the port of Fujairah on the Arabian Sea side of the country. Iraq had the option of routing some exports through the Kirkuk-Ceyhan pipeline to the Mediterranean via Turkey. But the combined capacity of these alternative routes was assessed at approximately 9 million barrels per day against the 20 million barrels per day that normally transited the strait, leaving a substantial gap that alternative infrastructure could not fill. Trump waived the Jones Act shipping rules for 60 days to ease domestic oil market pressures. The U.S. Treasury allowed a 30-day period for the sale of Iranian oil at sea in an attempt to moderate energy prices. The economic management of the crisis was consuming significant policy bandwidth alongside the military operations. These were not the moves of a government managing a controlled situation. These were the moves of a government buying time, managing pressure, and searching for an exit from a crisis that military force had started but could not finish alone. The Strait of Hormuz does not care about ultimatums. It does not respond to Truth Social posts or press briefings. It responds only to one thing, which is whether the ships can move safely through it. Right now, most of them cannot. And until the political decisions catch up with the military ones, the global economy will continue to pay the price for every day that the answer stays the same.